But with that said, I kind of see some people look at a dashboard, treat it like a hammer, right? Where it's like, oh, there's a nail, everything's a nail at that point. And so it's like, oh, I can tell a story with a dashboard. And I'm like, no, no, you can't.
Well, thank you, Brent, for joining us. I'm very excited to have you on just because on a number of different instances, the people that I'm podcasting, I'm usually finding your book sitting there on their shelf in the
Mm,
background of the podcast, which is it's just fascinating, interesting, and the concepts that you're bringing on how to actually drive value to an organization stemming from storytelling, which I think is absolutely critical. And so I think one of the big things I've seen from some of the content that you've produced is defining an insight, and that is an
mhm,
expected shift in the way we understand things, right?
mhm.
And so with that, when was the insight that gave you the perspective to author this book, The Effective Data Storytelling?
Yeah, so I started presenting on data storytelling at Adobe Summit back in, I think the first time I did it was 2014.
Oh,
And I
wow.
was really
Okay.
passionate. Yeah, I was really passionate about data storytelling and thought that this would be a really neat topic. And it ended up being one of the most popular sessions at the summit that are basically Adobe Marketing's Marketing Cloud's kind of regular summit, annual summit
Right.
that they have. And so that was kind of a hint to me that I was onto something, or this was something that other people cared about or were interested in. The next couple of Adobe summits, I presented on the topic, and then I started to present at other conferences on the topic. And people would literally come up to me after the session and say, "Hey, what books could you point me to? What information, do you have a book on this?" And that kind of shed light on, what, I really need to do something on this topic. And so it was something that I got an early signal on, that there were
Right.
people interested in this topic, and there was a lot of noise at the time, and I think there's still noise today. So I'm just trying to help people understand that data storytelling is more than just data visualization. It brings in data visualization, but there's other important pillars to doing effective data storytelling.
Yeah, so you kind of hit on the head on that. There's still a lot of noise there. And I think, kind of
Hmm.
much like with data governance or data strategy, right? There's a lot of people saying they're doing it, but not
Hmm.
necessarily actually doing it. And
Right.
my assumption is that that's currently going on with data storytelling. People are saying because they are presenting a visualization, they are doing data storytelling. And I would love for you to kind of like break down, like, how do you distinguish between somebody who's saying they're doing it and actually doing it?
Well, I think there's some kind of misconceptions out there. One of the misconceptions is that data visualization equals data storytelling. And obviously, data visualization is a key component of data storytelling, but there's also the narrative, there's the data in terms of like understanding the audience and finding the right, you mentioned insights. I believe that data stories should be about sharing insights with decision makers and helping them to make better decisions. And there's the whole narrative arc and different things that go into that. There's obviously, from a storytelling perspective, there's the emotion and the connection with the audience and different things. But I think that's one area, the data visualization. People think, oh, I visualize the data, it's telling a story. And I
Right.
kind of react to that like, oh no, you're telling part of a story potentially. I think that one chart or one visualization is rarely going to tell an entire story. People point to, the Napoleon campaign that was done by Charles Menard, but that's so rare. That's so rare that you can collapse so much information into one chart and tell an entire
Right.
story.
Right. It's like a
Um,
one frame, right? They'd say these dashboards, and
yeah,
it's just
like
like a frame or an instance of the larger narrative.
yeah, there's more going on, and that's the other area. I think a lot of people think, oh, I build dashboards, I tell stories, and I'm like, no, dashboards. Actually, I'm going to be writing an article on really clarifying yet again. If this will be the second time I've written an article on this. Dashboards do not tell stories. They help us to find potential stories. They can be a great vehicle for monitoring the business and watching those key metrics. And when something kind of changes, maybe there's a shift, there's a spike or a dip in a key metric, or there's some kind of trend or cycle or pattern that emerges from the data. Usually you have to then do some analysis, dig into that, and really understand what's going on, maybe get more context, and then you can start to formulate a story. But even in some cases, you might see an anomaly and then you explain it, and it's like, okay, well, there's no insight there. It's just, oh, there was an error on our tracking. We just tracked the data wrong,
Right.
or oh, it was back to school sale day, no real insight there. It's just a big promotion, and so that's why I had the big spike in sales. I mean, I'm very particular about data stories being based on insights, and really an insight being an unexpected shift in the way we understand things. And for me, that's, you've got an interesting and a good story if you've got an insight. If you don't have an insight, you could have a very boring vanilla story. And honestly, vanilla stories do not go anywhere. They don't change anything. They don't really do anything. It's really having that insight, that thing that's gonna, oh my gosh, I had no idea our customers felt that way, or oh my gosh, I had no idea that our competitor had done that, and that means, or I had no idea that our business process, was broken in this area. Whatever it is, that changing people's understanding. And then also, as part of a data story, we're not just like sharing the insight and that's it. No, we're an entire data story package includes, okay, well, what do we do about it? What's the so what? Why does this matter to me as a decision maker? And then what are my options? How do I make the best decision possible? Those are all parts of in my mind what a real data story is about.
Yeah, so the insight's kind of like the diadem, and the crown is kind of the story and the narrative that brings the so what, or the
Mm-hmm.
picture. And then would you say then dashboards are kind of like the facilitator of actual practical implementation of that? Like once you identify an insight, and then people are using those as KPIs marching down the fulfillment of the change of action. Is that how you would say data dashboards fit into that?
Yeah, I mean, you could if you're making a decision, you say, okay, we're going to launch this new campaign to address this market need that we discovered in the data. Well, then we set up tracking, we monitor how
Right.
well that campaign's doing. And so yeah, so the dashboard could be a part of monitoring how well we're executing or implementing on our strategy. It could also be before that, where we've got different campaigns going on and we see, oh, we've got maybe we've got some new campaign that's really doing really well, and it kind of bubbles up to the surface and we say, oh, why is it doing well? And then we start investigating, we do further analysis, we find out, oh, it's because it's got this offer, it's targeting this particular target segment, blah, blah, blah. And then, so I think dashboards could actually set up potential insights that then we act on. And then to your point, after we've made that action and we want to understand, well, how did we did? What were the outcomes? What were the real world outcomes that we drove through our analysis or through the implementation of our insight or taking advantage of that insight?
Or do
And
you
then,
use or do you recommend a feedback loop that's kind of
oh
back
yeah,
into another data story that says, okay, we made the insight, we
yeah,
presented this story, we made these changes, and now here is the actual value proposition of the data decisions that we made. And so,
yeah,
is there a
and that and
place
that
where you
may
see there a place for dashboards, or is that kind of something you think is kind of like this distraction factor?
No, I see. I know there's people out there that are kind of anti-dashboard and kind of like, you know, crap on dashboards, and I'm not in that camp. I see a role for dashboards in providing information so we can monitor how well we're doing. I think there's an exploratory component, a light exploratory component to most dashboards where you can drill in and filter data. The great thing about dashboards is they put information in the hands of more people and take data that's maybe just in a silo, that most business people can't access and don't know how to get to. It puts it out there so that more people have access to the information. But with that said, I kind of see some people look at a dashboard, treat it like a hammer, right? Where it's like, oh, there's a nail, everything's a nail at that point. And so it's like, oh, I can tell a story with a dashboard. And I'm like, no, no, you can't. It's not effective for that. And so you need to, use a different tool or a different approach for storytelling. But that doesn't mean just because dashboards don't tell stories, they're not useful. No, they're just useful for other purposes. And I think that's what people miss sometimes.
So when you're presenting these actual stories, do you practically have recommendations on how you go about that? So for audiences who may not have read your book or things of that nature, that you feel like, it's best to take images of your visuals and then embed them into PowerPoint, or what do you recommend for those who haven't actually read your book or are not familiar with your
Mm-hmm.
content to go ahead and implement?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing, the crux of when you're telling a data story, you're following a story arc, right? And
Right.
there's many models out there. A lot of people say, oh, but stories have a beginning, middle, and end. I find that completely useless in terms of advice because a
Right.
report can have a beginning, middle, and end. But digging a little bit deeper into the models that are out there, I kind of landed on one that was developed by a German playwright by the name of Gustav Freytag,
Okay.
and he studied Shakespearean plays and Greek tragedies, and he found that they all had this kind of arc to them. And so at the beginning of the story, in a traditional story, you'll have kind of establishing the setting or the scene or who are these characters? What's the time period? What's the location? Let's take Harry Potter, right? So it's in England, and here we
Right.
are, we see this boy who's, orphaned and left, he has a miserable life sleeping in the under the stairs, and that's kind of where we encounter the character, and then all of a sudden we have like what they call in traditional literary devices an inciting incident, and what I call it in data storytelling is that we have to have a hook. We have something that captures the attention of the audience, and often what that is we see kind of like an observation. We make an observation in the data. We see that there's a spike in sales or a drop in sales or something that would interest or be of concern to the audience that we're delivering the data story to. So in the Harry Potter world, that was when Harry Potter early in the story, he went to the zoo with his relatives, and then he spoke to a snake. And then that was like the first moment that he kind of realized, oh my gosh, there's something going on here. I have some kind of magical powers. So that began that journey of Harry Potter. And then obviously he goes to Hogwarts and then plays Quidditch and makes friends, and then building up uh, to this big climax, right, where he's battling Voldemort. And in a traditional data story, we can follow that same pattern, right? So we have this hook where we see an increase. Let's say it's an increase in sales, and then we start to investigate why did we have this increase in sales, and so we take those insights that when we analyze the data, we found, oh, it was because of this and this and this, and then we're building up to what I call our aha moment, which is our big insight that, hey, like we found that we're selling more products or making more sales in this area. We've analyzed it further and found that there's a huge market opportunity that's untapped. Could mean $20 million of, if we just took a couple of our products and tailored them a little bit more to this specific market, we could generate $20 million in revenue. So we've
Right.
got our aha moment. And then if we just stop there and didn't go any further, and then it's like, okay, well, there's $20 million opportunity, and decision makers are like, well, what do we do about it? How do we capture that? So in my view, and just like a story, once you've kind of battled Voldemort, then Harry Potter, then we kind of see that he's in the hospital recovering after his injuries, and then and he finds out that his house won the House Cup at
Right.
Hogwarts, and he's now a wizard and all that. So we have to kind of close out the story too. And in this case, here are the three options that we have for capturing this $20 million market. We can go in very aggressive, or we can go in conservative, or we can go in somewhere in the middle. And then obviously we're not making the decision for the audience. We might have a recommendation. We might say, we think maybe the middle ground is the best approach, not too conservative, not too aggressive, just in the middle. And then ultimately the decision makers have all of the information. That's the magical thing about a data story is you're setting up the context, you're giving them context to understand what the opportunity is or what the problem is, and then you're giving them the so what and what the insight is, and then also the potential steps that they need to take and the actions, the decisions that they need to make on how to move forward. And so they're learning about the business. Every time an audience hears a data story, they're learning about customers, they're learning about the market, they're learning about internal business processes or whatever the stories are about. But those audiences are also being equipped with information to then make decisions and drive forward. And a lot of times in analytics, we get frustrated because we're doing all this heavy lifting to get the data, to prepare it, to build dashboards and reports, and then we see it go nowhere. We see people are making decisions without using the data, and we get
Right.
frustrated. But I think a lot of that problem is in that last mile where we're kind of not really going that last mile, and that's really where communicating your insights and making sure people that they really understand your insights and are fully equipped to then make decisions and act on them. That's really critical.
Yeah. So how do you? What are some recommendations you would have to individuals who are building that story arc and making sure that they don't fall into the normal ditches of like let's use like Moby Dick or J.R. Tolkien for example, who are
Hmm.
like extremely verbose in all of the like superfluous details
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
actually don't bring about like, don't get me wrong, people enjoy the stories. The stories are phenomenal.
Hmm.
But if you are bringing a story arc and you're trying to do it in a succinct manner to actually drive value, well, where you're actually trying to captivate the audience,
Hmm.
like oftentimes what I see is everybody brings in the research and all the baggage associated with how they got to
Right.
the insight. And what are some recommendations you would provide? I think you've commented on this on your book as well of
Yeah.
people like bringing in the whole kitchen sink, so to speak, to the narrative arc and the story arc.
Yeah, I think one of the common mistakes a lot of data professionals make is that they like to tell the story of their journey to the insight.
Mm,
And honestly, a lot of business people don't care. They don't care about all the steps you took to cleanse the data and all the different analyses approaches that you use to get to that insight. It's really more about like, okay, so what is it? What's the impact to the business? We have to kind of change the orientation away from us and our journey to what's going to really matter. And I think that the story arc can really be useful because often what happens if you have done a lot of analysis and data, they can quickly turn into a data dump, right? So
right.
there's no discernment about what's important to the audience because it's just a collection of random data points, and it's almost like analysts are just throwing data points at a wall, hoping that something will stick and resonate with the audience. However, if you go through that storytelling arc process where you're okay, so and that even begins with who the heck is your audience? Who are you telling this story to? That even before we get into the story arc is really critical. If we understand what their problems are, what the outcomes they're trying to drive, where are they investing money today or resources, time and effort? Where is that going? What are the KPIs? What are the key metrics that they're focused on? Understanding all of that about our audience, then we can really streamline the story because I think obviously we think of these books like Moby Dick and Lord of the Rings and different things, and there's a ton of detail, but putting that aside, I think in a data storytelling context, having an arc where I outline, okay, you got to have a hook, okay,
Right.
got to establish the setting, and then you've got to build up to your aha moment. And in some cases, you could have a very simple story that only has one or two steps to get to your aha. Or in other cases, maybe it's a very complex analysis, and walking the audience through maybe 4 or 5 steps is necessary for them to kind of get that aha moment for themselves.
So how
Um, but
much of,
but
of the building and development of that narrative and
mhm.
defining what's superfluous and what's value, do you consult with the business? Do you do this in kind of solidarity with the data team, or how much of that is a collaborative effort, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways that you can build a data story. Obviously, you need to understand your audience. That can trip you up. When you don't understand your audience, you can tell a story that doesn't matter to them. That's kind of like the worst waste of time that we can have. We're wasting our time, we're wasting the audience's time. So I think the first starting point is to really try and understand the audience as much as you can, to understand I found an insight. I believe it's important and it's aligned with their priorities and it's aligned with what they're focused on. I'm going to have a captive audience then if I've found something that they care about.
Right.
What do my audience care about? And then crafting that data story, we remove anything that doesn't advance the story. If it doesn't build up to what we need it to kind of, we take that hook. What is my entry point into the story? What's going to get people interested in hearing the rest of the story? That's a first thing. And then obviously the insight itself is also critical. And then it's just being as efficient as possible, just including as much information as needed to really build up from the hook to the aha moment. And in my book and in my courses that I do, I talk about a process of storyboarding. And so taking that process that was innovated by Disney when they were doing their animated short
Mm.
films, they realized that, I guess early on they realized there was a lot of work to go through all these steps, get to the end where it's actually everything's been inked and put into film, and then to make edits at that point was very costly. And so what Walt Disney quickly realized was, wait a second, we're artists here. We can sketch what our scenes, what scenes should be, and work on the narrative first to make sure that we have something that's going to really work from a story perspective. And then once the narrative is in place and we've got that storyline that we think is going to work, we then start to go, okay, now we create the visuals. And I think that same process can be valuable in data storytelling, because sometimes what I find is people start working on the visuals, the data visualizations, and polishing them and refining them. And they haven't really thought about what's the story here? How do all these
Right.
things connect?
Yeah.
And so you start wasting time. So that storyboarding process is really important to figure out what your story is. What are those key components like your aha and your hook, and also obviously your recommendations and next steps. But figuring that out before you start going through that process of visualizing everything to an explanatory way and to tell your story, that comes later. But let's get the narrative down first.
Wonderful. And I love that notion of the storyboard, because then it forces them to not kind of to slow down in building the story and looking at it
Mm-hmm.
from a bird's eye view. And then it allows them to kind of determine, are they articulating themselves in a way that's communicating what they're hoping to. I love that. So then, obviously, for those who haven't read your book, like the first place, the cookbook to, as you said in your most recent LinkedIn post, is the book, right? But then you also have a workshop where you can come in and help like train a team to do that. And do you
Yeah.
have any like success stories that you are able to speak about? And maybe NDAs have prevented you from doing that, but do you have any success stories from your workshops where you've been able to take what they were excited about from the book and how to like they were then able to like implement into some incredible value propositions?
I remember one client, and that's kind of like, when you deliver your trainings and you kind of, I hopefully set up my clients for success to apply what I've taught them.
Right.
But actually getting feedback and follow up on how they're doing with it. But there was one client that I was working with, and they'd scheduled a couple of workshops. One was on narrative, and one was on visuals. I have another workshop series that I do where I do 5 sessions, 2 hours, and I cover full breadth of topics. But in between the two sessions that I did for them, I heard back from the training department that one of the people at their company had said that what they learned in my session, they were able to apply immediately, that story arc to their presentation, and it did wonders for the presentation, how it was received, and where it went from there. So that was just one example. I wish I could say, oh, here's Terry Joe at so and so company, and
Right.
and he
And NDAs are
generated
probably constricting.
$2 million.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously nobody's going to come back to me and tell me that, but it's, I do talk to people and they see success in the methodologies and the frameworks that I share, and they have helped them to communicate more effectively. And so it's something that I still believe in, and something that I know can really benefit people. And then I've, some smaller organizations haven't been able to take advantage of my workshops because they're obviously geared towards maybe like 15, 20, 30 or more people. And so I rolled out a masterclass course, and so we rolled it out as a beta. So uh, soon we're going to have everything done, and it's going to be 100% done. But it gives individuals and smaller teams an opportunity to tap into the content that I have, and really improve their data storytelling skills.
Awesome. And so then, do you have a date that you're expecting that to be fully released for them to be able to, or is there any
Yeah,
like promotions for those who are using the beta to kind of give feedback right now?
yeah, we did a promotional launch, and we can extend that promotional 25% discount to people who are joining the beta. So that's something that we're offering. And then we're hoping to have everything wrapped up by March. That's kind of mid-March should be when we're targeting for completion of the. Just this week, we're rolling out the fourth and largest section on visualization. So the, the first three sections are already done. So we have an introduction to the power of data storytelling. That section's done. Then we have a data section. We have the narrative section done. Those three are already available. This week we'll be rolling out the visual section, which is a big update. And then after that, we have a delivery section, and that one probably a smaller section. So we should be able to get that done in a couple weeks. And then the last one is an application section, and that's going to require a little bit more work from my side. Just want to get one more story in there, one more
Okay.
example, kind of end to end kind of data stories so people can see more examples. So I have a couple already built, but I wanted to get one more ready for that section. And then that should be launching in mid March. And then beyond that, once we launch this masterclass, we think we might do an essentials version. So it'll be a more streamlined, shorter
Okay.
uh,
Crash course.
option. Yeah.
Yeah. So in your masterclass, the four sections on the visualization side, and I know you've kind of gone into the psychology of visualizations, and I've
Mhm.
seen some of the work you've done as of late. Would you mind just even talking about just even the notion of color and different aspects of the psychology that goes into visualizations and how that can make such a significant impact?
Yeah, I've been really fascinated by the psychology behind storytelling and visualizations. And so when I was writing my book, I didn't want to settle for just like, oh, do this because it's a best practice. I
Right.
wanted to understand, well, why? Why is it a best practice? What's driving that to be effective? And so I researched a lot of psychology around it. So if you're familiar with Daniel Kahneman, if you've read his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, uh,
Mm,
very influential in terms of, I mean, and there's Antonio Damasio, another neuroscientist. And so all of these people are looking at how we make decisions. That's kind of like the first area that I've
right.
looked at. And there's the psychology behind how we make decisions. And obviously, Daniel
And that
Kahneman talks about system one and system two. And
Yeah, and that blend of the thinking fast and system one, system two is kind of like the routine versus kind of like the more in depth thinking. Am
Mhm.
I on the right page?
Yeah, like so the system one is our intuition, is our unconscious brain
Right.
using heuristics and pattern seeking. We don't even think about it. It's just our brain is processing all the stimuli, and and then system two is our conscious thinking brain, and our conscious thinking brain really leans on the system one a lot to like kind of it pre-processes the information and then hands it to the thinking brain. We kind of go on autopilot. So there's interesting things there from a decision making perspective, how we react to stories, and how often that system one is actually trying to make sense of the world around it, and it really responds well to stories because that's what it's actually doing. It's taking all these disparate data points, kind of saying, oh, well, this is what this means. It's forming a story around how it's interpreting the world and how we interact with the world. Now that's one part of it. The other part that's interesting, and maybe what you were getting at, was from a visuals and from a human perception perspective, how do we process information and data
Right.
and visuals? And that's where you get into Gestalt principles. Those come from the German psychologists around the turn of the 20th century, where they looked at how we group information based on proximity or similarity and these different principles. And then there's the pre-attentive processing, the pre-attentive attributes that we associate with, color. Using color. Why does color stand out so much, and why is that so powerful? And then other things like size, and these basically. How does our brain look at information and start to say, oh, seems important, or I should notice this? And then when we're telling data stories visually, we want to leverage these principles to help people navigate the information, pay attention to what really matters, and then even pattern recognition. That's a big part of the human, how we've evolved and how we process information. We're looking at patterns. How do we lean into that and help the audience to recognize patterns more easily and kind of follow our story, and that's all a part of the visual storytelling aspect of data storytelling.
Yeah, and so the narrative side of the data storytelling, right? One of the things that I heard you talk about and is this idea of kind of like presenting facts actually puts people on guard. And
Mm-hmm.
it actually like really triggered me to think about, like, are you familiar with Chris Voss, the FBI negotiator? Have you heard of
No,
this?
no, I'm not. Maybe I have, but I don't.
Okay,
I
yeah. So
haven't
his
associated
big
his
thing is
name.
kind of the psychology centered around like people inherently are like put on defensive mode when you
Mm-hmm.
frame questions
Right.
that's almost insinuating that they're going to say yes or driving for a yes, especially in like the sales space. You present these things that you lead them into a yes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so he was actually like created this like notion of like, no, like you actually want to frame questions in such a way that you want to get them to say no to your question, because no is disarming and it's not actually like, it's one of the most powerful words in the English language.
Mm-hmm.
So you can, if you could teach them to say no, so you would say things of the nature of like, would you be opposed to joining this meeting? Right. And then
Mm-hmm.
their natural inclination is like, no. Right. And so they're more likely to
Mm-hmm.
um, be disarmed and not have to put up
Right.
that guard. And I know you kind of alluded to this in this idea of facts actually put people on defense. Maybe you
Right.
can kind of speak about that for a moment.
Yeah, there was I don't know the names of the psychologists, but they did a study where they looked at how, doing the scans of the brain and different things, and they found that when like say you have a viewpoint on a topic, and somebody comes with data showing the opposite or conflicting, uh, these psychologists found that the way we react to a fact that's goes against our viewpoint or
Your
our
ideology, or
yeah,
whatever.
our ideology or whatever. It's the same. The reaction we have to that is the same reaction that you would have to a bear if you were hiking and ran across a predator. That alarm or that reaction,
Right.
fight or flight
That
kind of
defensive, like,
reaction.
still
Yeah,
process and assess. I don't know where this is
it's
going, but I'm not liking it.
yeah,
uh,
exactly. That same escalation or reaction that we have that to facts and data that conflict with our viewpoint. And so that shows how hard it can be to kind of share information. And that's the magic of narrative, is that when you package information in the form of a narrative, the guard goes down. People are less they're less going to nitpick on the details. They're going to be less defensive. They're going to be more open-minded. They're going to be more willing to consider a different perspective when you frame it as a narrative, as a story. And so it breaks down some of those barriers that we run into when we just fact, 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 fact. When we can package it as a narrative, all of a sudden people will give it a chance. They may consider what we're
yeah.
sharing with them.
And that's incredibly insightful, especially when you consider how much, I don't want to say necessarily conflict of interest, but when you're working with decision makers, they have their own outsetted goals that they're trying to
Right,
accomplish. And when you're presenting facts that can run counter to that, it can be very abrasive to them. And so then
right,
cause to reason the necessity for data storytelling to kind of come alongside them and be a partner as opposed to being a combatant.
right.
So yeah, I really appreciate that. Well, Brent, thank you so much for your time on this, and we really appreciate your insights. I would encourage anybody to go to take a look at Analytics Heroes, is your website, and if
Or
they want,
effective data storytelling.
or
Effective
effective data.
data storytelling. Yeah, so analyticshero.com is my company website. You can definitely check that out. Or if you're interested in the book or workshops, then you'd want to go, or the course, go to effectivedatastorytelling.com.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And for those who are wanting to learn more, please go to Effective Data Storytelling. And that's for the workshop, the masterclass, and the book, which will
And
be
blog
kind of,
posts.
and blog posts as well. All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Thanks,
And
Ian, for having me on the show.